Welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar on why we need New York State renewable energy and not Canadian megadam hydro. This event is being brought to you by Sierra Club New York City Group and Grow New York Renewable, No Canadian Hydro. And it's also in recognition of and thanks to Meg Sheehan, co-founder of NAMRA, the North American Megadam Resistance Alliance. My name is Catherine Skopik. I was rep to the UN 20th anniversary of the first Global Climate Conference in Rio de Janeiro in 2012. And I also participated in the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. And I'm chair of New York City, Sierra Club New York City Group and delegate to the Sierra Club New York State Atlantic Chapter. We are in a climate crisis, as I'm sure you all know. It has been proclaimed code red by the global scientist authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. To continue life on this planet, we must immediately transition to renewable energy. We can no longer use coal, gas, oil, uranium. Be aware of the many false solutions out there. There is a difference between natural waterfall and the water falling over a person-made dam. The first is renewable, the second is not. 1896, the Niagara Falls power plant began sending its current along high voltage lines to Buffalo, New York, the first. Niagara Falls still supplies renewable power to New Yorkers, but do not be fooled. The energy from person-made megadams, multiple times the size of the Hoover Dam, are anything but renewable. They cause more greenhouse gases, destroy thousands of trees that would remove CO2 from our atmosphere, naturally reducing climate change. The Champlain Hudson Power Express would enable or cause more of these megadams to be built. And our first speaker is going to tell us more about this, Gary WOCKNER. Gary is a global environmentalist, activist, scientist, writer, and environmental whistleblower. Gary?
Okay, my name is Gary WOCKNER. I direct Save the Colorado and SaveTheWorldRivers.org. And I'm going to talk about the myth of clean hydropower today. I agree we are in a climate crisis, and hydropower is not a solution to the climate crisis. Dams and reservoirs emit greenhouse gases and make climate change worse. In fact, this has been widely in the news in the last 6 or 7 years, including here in the Washington Post, on CNN, New York Times, LA Times, other articles here across the globe, and I'm going to get into that as I get through the presentation. We all know that dams create many problems. Dams block rivers. They block fish, sediment, nutrients, and water. Dams slow rivers down, which changes the ecology, water temperature, sediment, and habitat. Dams almost always make water quality worse. Dams can cause extinction to fish and aquatic life. Dams displace people and cause human rights violations. Dams are expensive. Dams can make flooding worse. Dams exacerbate coastal flooding, beach erosion, and sea level rise. Dams increase disease in humans. Every one of those things happens with Hydro-Quebec's electricity that they're trying to ship down to New York State. In addition, dams also can make climate change worse. About 30 years ago, a team of scientists in Brazil, directed by this fellow here, Dr. Philip Burnside, started doing an analysis and calculating the amount of methane that is created by dams and reservoirs. It became it was new information 30 years ago, but it's become increasingly accepted by the scientific community. Since that time, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been major studies done by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, US Army Corps of Engineers, dozens of international university research scientists. The IPCC scientist in 2006 Kyoto Protocol included a an analysis of how flooded lands by reservoirs create methane, and that was also included in the 2019 IPCC update. And the U.S. National Science Foundation has also funded research about this issue. In 2015 and 2016, especially, there was global media attention around this issue, and it really, because a couple of major studies came out, so it became much more accepted in the public's eye as well as the scientists' eye. But it's still off the radar in New York and in New York City. How do dams create GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions? Well, one of the big ways is they cause dramatic deforestation. We all know that forests sequester carbon. And so when you chop the forest down or flood it, there's a massive release in carbon. Billions of acres of forests have been cleared worldwide for hydropower and also for transmission lines, which is an issue in this Chippy project. The forests do not regrow and are flooded. In Quebec, for Quebec's hydropower, Hydro-Quebec has flooded over 300 million acres of boreal forest. The second big way, which is the most consequential, that dams create greenhouse gas emissions, and especially methane, is by vegetation and organic material flowing into a reservoir. And then it breaks down underwater without the presence of oxygen, called anaerobic breakdown, which causes methane to be released. And this can happen for several reasons, because of nutrients and vegetation and various types of organic sediment flowing into the reservoir. It also can happen on the banks of reservoir when reservoirs go up and down. So they go down, a lot of green foliage grows on the side of the reservoir. Then the reservoir goes back up and it drowns all of that and it releases methane. There also is generally plants and sometimes trees and forests that are decaying underneath the reservoir, and also carbon heavy soils under a reservoir, that used to be the riverbed where the river existed, or the floodplain. And so when all of this decomposes, it releases methane, especially, but also carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And this amount of methane can be very significant. So we know that from the science that the greenhouse gas emissions are worse where the dam is bigger and the reservoirs are larger, especially where the surface area of the reservoir is larger, where the weather is warmer and wetter, where the initial flooding of the landscape involves large areas of vegetation. It's also worse where there's more vegetation and sediment running off into a reservoir. It's worse where reservoirs, the water level goes up and down on a seasonal or hydropower ramping cycle. It's worse in newer reservoirs that were more recently flooded. It's worse near agricultural areas where fertilizer-heavy water and erosion runs off into a reservoir, feeding the biological cycle that grows algae. And any type of place where there's a heavy nutrient load pouring into a reservoir. Big, flat, warm reservoirs in tropical countries are the worst. However, Canadian reservoirs have been estimated and measured to be also consequential GHG emitters. And I'll get right into that. All types of dams and reservoirs can create greenhouse gas emissions. There are two types of hydropower, generally traditional, which is where you have a dam and a reservoir. And then there's called run of the river. They both can be GHG emitters. Reservoirs also that are for flood control, water supply, and recreation. They can all create greenhouse gas emissions. This happens all over the planet. So how bad is the greenhouse gas pollution? A major study came out in 2016, which formalized the methodology for estimating greenhouse gas emissions from reservoir and different types of energy sources. It was peer-reviewed science, and it created this bar chart here where the carbon footprint, or the amount of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour for hydropower, is on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is the different type of energy source. So nuclear power has the least, then wind, then biomass burning, then solar energy. Hydropower can actually be very variable. So some can be relatively low, some can be extremely high. Oil, natural gas, starts around 400 kilograms of carbon dioxide per equivalent per megawatt hour. Hard coal here, and then of course lignite coal. So this is just sort of a range of energy sources and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they emit when they're operating. But they can be very significant for reservoirs. This study came out in 2014, which was reported on by Climate Central, who said those researchers suggest all large reservoirs globally could emit up to 104 teragrams of methane annually. By comparison, NASA estimates the global methane emissions associated with burning fossil fuels totals between 80 and 120 teragrams annually. So it can be as bad as fossil fuels in terms of methane emissions. The emissions are not being counted anywhere. In fact, in 2006, when the Kyoto Protocol came out with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they included ways for countries to estimate emissions. However, no one is reporting, no one is counting, and no one is reporting. Countries were supposed to do what's called an intended nationally determined contributions, but no, not one COP21 country is including or reporting emissions from hydropower. The new IPCC protocol is being considered, facing extreme political pressure by big hydro. I've written extensively about this, especially in EcoWatch and other news publications, about how this isn't happening, but it needs to. So I'm going to hit one reservoir in the United States just to give you an example of how this plays out. The study that I talked about in 2016 estimated the greenhouse gas emissions for Hoover Dam and Lake Mead, which is the biggest reservoir in the United States. And it estimated that Hoover Dam, Lake Mead's greenhouse gas emissions were roughly the same as a coal-fired power plant, even more than the very top end of natural gas. So that's just one estimate. A huge reservoir, the biggest in the entire country. It's sitting down in the sun, baking, very warm. And so it's a big emitter, and all of Southern California is served by this reservoir and this hydropower facility. No one is counting in the emissions. They're pretending like they don't even happen. I'm going to spend a little bit longer on this because now we're up into Hydro-Quebec. A scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology named Professor Bradford Hager actually used that 2016 study that I'm talking about and pulled out all the dam and hydropower projects in Quebec and graphed them in this table, and then I put them on this graph here. So you can see this column here, right here, that's got the yellow highlights in it. These are the estimated kilograms of CO2e per megawatt hour. And again, if you look over here, 400 is about the bottom of natural gas. And so anything up to and around 400 is as bad as natural gas. One big example is Churchill Falls, which is, of course, a well-known hydropower facility that wants to, is close to being built and wants to ship into the United States, is actually as bad as natural gas. The big kahuna, though, is all the way at the bottom. Canyapiscu Reservoir is a major hydropower facility, all part of the James Bay project. And I put it on the graph here. Here's Churchill Falls, around 436. Canyapiscu is way up here at 2,250, twice as bad as a coal-fired power plant in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions. Canyapiscu Reservoir, if you don't know, is the biggest body of water in Quebec, major hydropower producer, and a major greenhouse gas emitter. Hydropower is not clean. Here's what you need to know in New York City. Currently, around 60% of New York City's electricity is generated by natural gas power plants. Natural gas power plant emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, range from 395 to 1,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per megawatt hour. Quebec hydropower facility greenhouse gas emissions range from 100 to 2,250, with an average of those 16 plants in that study of around 386. So it's about the same as the bottom end of natural gas. So obviously importing hydropower from Quebec is not going to make any consequential difference than already using, in your climate change emissions, than already using natural gas. There are also emissions that are not calculated, that are not quantified yet, that scientists are working on. There's massive amounts of construction in when you make hydropower, obviously concrete to make dams, hauling and trucking. The deforestation is actually not included in these estimates either. And there's also downstream wetlands and forest alteration. So the numbers that we looked at are more than likely low, and the actual amount of greenhouse gas emissions are likely higher. So the outcome, again, switching from natural gas to hydropower is likely to cause more greenhouse gas emissions, not less, for New York City. So what do you do about this? How do you fight the myth of clean hydropower to protect rivers? You got to counter the greenwashing. In 2022, as you know, New York will have to start reporting the greenhouse gas emissions from imported electricity. And groups like the Sierra Club should definitely be involved in that and make sure any imported electricity from Hydro-Quebec or anything related to hydropower is accurately counted and reported as greenhouse gas emission. There's greenwashing by the hydropower industry, especially Hydropower Quebec. There's greenwashing by elected officials and government officials. You hear it all the time, and you heard it in the mayor's race in New York City. You heard it at the governor level of the governor's office in New York City. It needs to be countered. The banks, which funds this, often also do greenwashing, and some environmental groups also do greenwashing. And we actually point this out. So once again, hydropower is not clean energy. It can and often is as bad as natural gas, and sometimes as many greenhouse gas emissions as coal-fired power plants. New York City should not be importing electricity from Hydro-Quebec. Again, I'm Gary WOCKNER with Save the World's Rivers. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Gary, so much. You've told us all we need to know.
It's my pleasure. Big fan of the Sierra Club. I'm a 30-year card-carrying member of the Sierra Club, and I just keep up all the great work, Catherine.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Gary, for not only your presentation here, but all your work on the Colorado River and everywhere else in the world. Thank you so much. Thank you. An Indigenous perspective is the next speaker that we will hear from. And this is Will Nichols. And Will is a Cree from Mistissiwi and is co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Nation, a Montreal-based publication, and we'll also talk about life before and after megadams. Will, the floor is yours.
Gotcha. Mistissiwi, Will Ni. Now, I always like to start off in Cree, and that's simply like, hi, my name is Will, and I'm from Mistissiwi, means the big rock. I'm one of the big rock people, Mistissiwi, EU. And when I was, well, let's start. You want to know about life before Hydro-Quebec? My mother was actually born on the land. We have a system of tallymen who have certain territories. So we're sort of nomadic, but not really nomadic because there are certain territories. And when they were coming back from, there was 3 families in this one territory who had 3 territories, but they were coming back into the community and they were paddling. And since my grandmother was pregnant, they put her on the furs. And when she started feeling some of the contractions, the men went ahead and they got to this island and they set up 2 tents. And by the time the women got there with my grandmother, they had the water boiling and everything else. And they'd taken the tents, and inside the tents, they lay down tree boughs to make sort of like a cushion. And it smells great, by the way. And so all the women go into one tent with my grandmother, and the men go into the other tent. And they wait. And when they hear the yell from my grandmother that her contractions are starting, the men start beating a drum. And they beat to the heartbeat so that it calms down my grandmother. because your heart will start to beat with the drum. It'll go in tune with it. And they took turns singing all night until my mother was born. And then they stopped. All those women who were in the tent considered themselves aunts of my mother. All the men considered themselves uncles. And since my grandmother was young and she didn't have enough breast milk, there was another woman who was breastfeeding. She always, whenever she'd see my mother, she would say, "How's my daughter?" She considered herself a mother. There is that type of thing. There was sharing. You know, I remember when I was there was no road into my community at first. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was no telephones. None of the things everyone takes for granted these days. You know, I remember having to take a yoke and 2 pails to go down and collect water. You know, using an axe to chop wood, because you always chopped wood, whether or not it was for the wood stove for your food that day, or to actually stack up for the winter. You know, and the sharing, when a man would, or that, or family would bring in something like fish, or else someone maybe had taken like a moose or something like that, the man would go around with his drum and he'd beat it and he'd sing his hunting song around the community. And that would let everyone know to come and to get a piece of what the land gave us, of what the animals gave to us, to share, you know. And the songs were nice. Some of them were funny. I remember my uncle Kenny, he used to make everyone laugh because his hunting song was hunting rabbits. You know, whereas other people sang about, like, you know, hunting moose or something like that. His was like hunting a rabbit and how to do it. And it was quite funny. You know, our homes, you know, as a young man and as a young person, I'm sure everyone's done this. You've gone out drinking and stuff like that. We never thought anything about going into somebody's house because there was no locks on the door late at night and people would be sleeping. And you'd go to the room where you wanted to talk to the person, wake them up and talk to them. And there was no problems with that. That's not happening today. You know, we've got different types of homes. But these were the things. Growing up it was always sharing, caring, getting taught by those who went before you and learning it, because those people who tried to live off the land are dead and gone. Those people who learned to live with the land still had an incredibly hard time. Out of 11 children, there was 4 who survived out of my grandmother's generation. That's how harsh our land is compared to down here. So you had to learn to do things. You had to learn how to share. You had to learn to know that you depended upon other people in order to survive. And you learn to do it well. And we are the accumulation of that. The land created the Crees. It made us who we are. Our walking out ceremonies is a child, male or female, will not touch the land for a period probably up to a year. It's until they can walk. And then we have a special ceremony where there's a tent or a teepee, a path of tree boughs around a tree. And in the case of my son, he was in the tent, he's dressed traditionally. The mother, the aunts, uncles, grandmothers, and that are in there, grandfather, they put a little food into his pouch beside him. And then he comes to the door. I take him by the hand and we walk out to where the tree is, because I'm going to be one of his teachers. That's why I take him by the hand. You help those who are younger than you are. When we get to where the tree is, I kneel down, I take a gun that's there, a .22, and I take his hands and I put it around him, and he fires off the first shot of his life. When he wanted to shoot it again after, but we only put one bullet in. And then I take a goose that I had killed during the spring goose hunt, and we left all the feathers on, and we just gutted it, and we put a string on it, and we put it around them. And in this case, I had my brother, Donald NICHOLLS, take him back to the tent because he'd be one of his teachers too. And I followed, and he gets to the tent, and he goes inside, and the food that they had given him, he takes out, and he shares it with everyone in there, showing what it is. As a hunter of the people, you share what you get from the land, because the land doesn't give just to you, it gives to all your people, because they recognize the value of human beings on the land. And then we have a big feast and that. Well, what's behind this? One of it is the high infant mortality rate. It's your introduction to Cree society, to the Cree people. And it's a celebration. But there's also something else there. If you're not allowed to touch the land outside of a tent or a house for almost a year, you know, think about it as kids. You're curious. You want to get down, check out the snow, the grass. You want to see the little puppies or whatever, but you're not allowed to. So you realize when you're let go that it's not a right to walk on the land, it's a privilege. And it's the beginning of your obligations as a human being, something as small as walking on the land. That is how we were brought up, to realize that you have an obligation to what is around you and to everyone else around you. And as you grow older, you get more and more obligations. And that happens for every society, for every culture. And that's how I grew up. I grew up knowing this intimately and having this bond that is hard for some people to understand. So then Hydro-Quebec came along. You know, remember, there's no road into my community, nothing. You know, we had just started getting, I think by that time, I think we just started getting a road in and stuff. And my great-grandfather was actually one of the people who testified at the hearings against Hydro-Quebec, because we fought it. You know, these natives who had only been to residential school and stuff, we actually had some people interested in helping us, and we beat them. We won. We won the decision to stop it. And then 7 days later, with no additional information, nothing, basically the highest court in Quebec overturned it. And we were told by our lawyers at that time, by the time it got to the Supreme Court, the dams would have been built. We should be making a deal. And so we made the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement to help take control back of some of the things that were done with us. And we did well, for the most part. We got control of our education, so no longer did our children be taken and been sent out to residential school. I was there until I was almost 12. We got control of our policing. We got control of our health services. There was very limited health services beforehand and whatnot. And, you know, like the problems that Hydro-Quebec had when they came around and we were finally starting to try to get some sense of this and make some deals was translations. Our numbers only went up so high. So talking about megawatts and whatnot, the guy who was translating for the Hydro-Quebec guy trying to explain it just started going da 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 da. And everyone started laughing. And the guy goes, "What are you laughing at?" He goes, "I had to tell him it was lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots." You know, we were worried in my community that the water levels might rise up enough to actually flood parts of our communities. Chisasabi used to be Fort George, and it was on an island. And that community had to be moved to the mainland because they were worried that the increased water flow would wipe out the island. You know, and they've celebrated their, I think it's 40th anniversary just recently of the move. And one of the surprising things is one of the biggest pictures I seen in one of the newspapers was they moved one of the churches over, you know, by barge from the island to the community, which is, you know, kind of funny in a way. And things, how's it changed? Well, one of the things they didn't talk about with the mega dams and the problems, the anaerobic actions with methane, I know, but what they didn't talk about was methyl mercury. We had bogs and we had a lot of forests, and they didn't cut them down beforehand. So you had an anaerobic action that released methyl mercury into the environment that was now consumable, that was now basically get into the fish and everything else. So much so that even today, I don't know if it's changed. I don't think it has. They said it's supposed to go down, but we were warning pregnant women and children not to eat so much fish and not to eat certain types of fish. Right? The dams, they've changed our lives in terms of we have what we call dead zones. There's up to 1 kilometer on either side that basically because of how much what do you call it? Fluctuation there is in water when people want energy more or less, and it goes up and down. So you've got up to 1 kilometer on each side that are like mud flats at times. Nothing can grow there. And these are the most productive parts of our land. And it's been a problem for the people who have lived there. Like 2 communities along the coast, because the rivers were diverted into the La Grande complex, have programs where people go out into the James Bay where there's less mercury, and they fish, and then they go around to the houses like once a week, knock on people's door and say, "How many fish would you like?" And there's all kinds of fish, and you tell them. Fish was traditionally 1/4 of our diet. Our thing used to be, it was the first food you ate because as a baby, you don't have any teeth. And it was the last food you ate because by then you might not have any teeth. You know? It's changed a lot of things. It's also made it so that we still live partially traditionally. 33% of us are on the land. Another 33% work for local businesses and government, you know, different levels of government, etc. And it's what the hell do we do with the other 33%? We're trying. But the thing too is we've come out, we have a highly educated population now. I mean, think about it. I've gone from basically cutting wood with no electricity in that, and we're doing computers and everything else now. And the reason why is we're a very survival-oriented people.
Will, excuse me, Will, this is so fascinating, but I
Oh,
wrap it up like in a minute or so. But I could listen for a long time, but we have to move on. Thank you. Thank you, Will.
what I would like to say is this. No, mega dams and stuff are not solutions. And don't think of something as a NIMBY, not in my backyard. Well, I'm sorry, we're in your backyard. You're going to have to deal with it because things that happen up north, the nutrients from my land and Churchill Falls and everything else go in to an environment that will affect you down south, just as those transmission lines and whatnot will be affecting you. And don't think nothing of sending a few messages to the people who are trying to do this, your government. They rarely get messages. Send them, email them over and over again. Like I said, they rarely hear from the voters once they're elected. Make sure they hear from you, because if they start hearing from you, then they start getting worried, because it's like, nobody's bothering me about this. But if you make them bother about this, you can make it happen. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Will, for being with us. That was so wonderful. There's so much more I'd like to learn about. And thank you for being with us. And I'm glad your computer and everything is working now.
So am I.
Thank you very much, Will. Really, from my heart. Thank you.
Thank you.
And next, we're going to have two speakers on the Hudson River. One speaker will be talking about the aquatic life of the river itself. The other speaker will be speaking about the people and the life of the people along the Hudson River. So we're going to start now with George Jackman, who is an aquatic ecologist, environmental activist, and habitat restoration manager for Riverkeeper. Okay, George?
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we got to start with, what the Hudson River was first like. When the European settlers first came to the Hudson River, they described an infinitude of fish that was beyond comprehension. They often mused that you could walk dry shod on the backs of the fish, and birds blocked out the sky for minutes at a time. And that forms the baseline of what we know. And there were passenger pigeons around then, and fish were extremely abundant. And the Hudson River estuary is the second largest spawning ground and fish nursery on the east coast of the United States. The estuary is home to over 200 species of fish, for all or part of their life. But today, all iconic Hudson River fish species are in long-term decline, with many depleted, and both species of native sturgeon are endangered. In fact, because the Hudson River is so critical for the sturgeon, it was recently designated by the National Marine Fisheries Service, NIMS, as critical habitat for the Atlantic sturgeon. But over the years, there's been terrific harms to the river. 4,000 acres of aquatic habitat and wetland habitats were lost in the upper third of the estuary. 3,300 acres were filled in. 700 acres of shallow water habitat was dredged. 85% of the river's islands were lost. Most of the river's side channels were filled, and 71 miles of shoreline habitat were also lost. And in the tributaries connecting to the Hudson, thousands upon thousands of dams and culverts block fish passage and restrict migratory and native species alike. Freshwater fishes are now the most imperiled creatures on the planet as a taxa, as a group. The federal dam at Troy disconnected the upper Hudson from the rest of the estuary. And now the Hudson currently holds the shameful distinction as the largest Superfund site in the country due to the presence of PCBs. And fish in the river are no longer suitable for human consumption. The Hudson River's biotic community is unstable and fast declining. The Atlantic sturgeon is endangered. The short-nosed sturgeon is endangered. Rainbow smelt have been extirpated. They are no longer found in the Hudson River. American shad are depleted. They've had failed recruitment for the past 20 years. Hickory shad are depleted. Alewife, depleted. Blueback herring, depleted. American eels, depleted. Winter flounder, depleted. Bay anchovy, long-term decline. Tomcod, vanishing. Extirpation from the Hudson is probable. White catfish, long-term decline. White perch, long-term decline. Striped bass in decline. Brook trout, severe decline. 400 square miles of oyster reefs were lost. Freshwater mussels are one of the most imperiled taxa on the planet and in the river and elsewhere. What we know about electromagnetic fields. All electrical cables will emit electromagnetic fields into surrounding water. Electric currents induce magnetic fields around these cables. The electric fields cannot be contained within the electric fields can be contained within the cables, but the magnetic fields produced by the electric fields cannot be contained. And these magnetic fields will induce secondary electric fields. Burying the cable helps, however, magnetic fields will still be created, as well as the induced electrical fields occurring as organisms swim through the magnetic fields. How does this impact fish? Well, many fishes have evolved the ability to navigate in a dark and featureless environment by utilizing the Earth's geomagnetic fields to determine their own position and orientation. How else do you migrate in this vast ocean or this river, and especially when it's dark? So the Earth's geomagnetic field acts like a GPS to fish. Some fish even have electroreceptors and use them to navigate, detect prey, or become aware of predators and find mates. However, the electromagnetic fields from these cables have been measured at magnitudes that are similar to the Earth's geomagnetic fields. The problem is that many fish can perceive electromagnetic fields from cables, but sharks and rays and sturgeon are extremely sensitive to them. Sturgeon, sharks, and eels alter their behavior when exposed to electromagnetic fields from cables. Sharks will actually become aggressive when exposed to energized cables and will even attack the cables. Fish like sturgeon and rays will expend excessive energy foraging for non-existent prey. It makes them feel that there's prey in the substrate, and which results in a caloric deficit. The most worrisome problem is that electromagnetic fields from transmission cables could cause migratory species to become disoriented and diverted from their migration pathways. On the Pacific coast, NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, created a safe migration corridor to protect the green sturgeon from electromagnetic fields. There was concern that the green sturgeon's migration routes could be altered by the electromagnetic fields emitted from transmission cables. The same protection, we feel the same protection should be granted to sturgeon in the Hudson River. Then there's other studies about the development. Scientific studies exposing trout larvae to low-level electromagnetic fields demonstrated altered development and altered circulatory patterns. The larvae also exhibited anxiety, behavioral changes, and disorientation in the presence of these low-level magnetic fields. A study in San Francisco Bay showed that the cable activation resulted in an 11.1% decrease of juvenile salmon attempting to out-migrate from the bay. What happens is some of the salmon smolts simply refuse to cross the active cable. Another study examined the effects of electromagnetic fields on eels. 40% of the eels would not cross an active cable. Problem for us is Atlantic sturgeon can take 20 years to sexually mature. If cable activation disrupts sturgeon spawning, damages the eggs, or harms the larvae in any way, we won't understand the consequences for 20 years. Once the cable is activated, there will be no way to undo the damages. Out of caution, Chippy will be rerouting the cable out of Haverstraw Bay since it is sensitive habitat. But moving the cable out of Haverstraw Bay implies that there is potential damage to the fishes. We've got to remember the entire Hudson River is critical habitat to sturgeon. Chippy first studied all these things in 2011, But since then, fish populations in the Hudson have continued to decline, yet scientific research has expanded, revealing that electromagnetic fields can harm aquatic organisms. The problem is that Chippy will extend 118 miles from Coeymans to Yonkers. The cable will run the length of the river, impacting all ecosystems and organisms along the way. The main concerns from Chippy for us are that the electromagnetic fields from the transmission cable will impact the fish's normal and migrational movements, alter their normal behaviors, disrupt their life history patterns, or impair their developmental processes. And then there are plans for other cables. Once one comes in, there will be many more following. There will be a synergistic and compounded impact from multiple cables deployed in the river. And then there's the legacy contaminants. You know, somebody else would discuss this more in detail, but PCBs, dioxin, and heavy metals exist at toxic levels in the Hudson sediments. During the installation, maintenance, and decommissioning of the cable, these sediments containing these toxins will be disturbed and resuspended. Suspension of these contaminants will remobilize them through the food chain. Cable deployment is a process that it requires specialized equipment. It'll be plowing, water jetting, dredging machines will be used in rocky sediments. In places where the cable won't be buried, cement mats will be utilized. TDI states that cement mats will create reef-like conditions. TDI also states that mats may develop an epibenthic community, as well as providing structure for the benthic fishes. Should we really center an ecosystem around 1,250 megawatts of power and hope that fish will spawn and lay their eggs on top of it? Would any normal person want to put their child on 1,250 megawatts of power? Then there's underwater noise associated with cable installation. This was never investigated. Noise will be generated in all aspects of route clearance, trenching, backfilling, and introduction. The problem is that this noise can cause harm to aquatic organisms by causing avoidance, disrupting feeding patterns, disrupting breeding patterns, altering migratory behaviors, masking communication, and causing death. Herring and shad are extremely sensitive to this because they use their swim bladders as an oversized eardrum for use as predator awareness. And construction and noise may cause these fishes harm or force them to flee their habitat. 60% of shad and herring spawning habitat has been lost. What we have now, 7 applications have been submitted to NYSERDA for Tier 4 energy credits. This conversation started with Chippy, but now it's all about all the cables in the river. But not all cables are equal, and we have to look at them separately. There are 3 cable applications submitted to NYSERDA that will run the length of the river. However, Chippy is the Darth Vader and the Freddy Krueger of all the projects. Chippy is bad because it uses hydropower, which we are vehemently opposed to, and we heard all the reasons why we should oppose hydropower. It displaces First Nations people from their ancestral land. We just heard about that. Revenues are diverted to a foreign-owned government utility. It impacts the drinking water for 7 Hudson River communities and creates potential shipping accidents because they won't be able to anchor due to cable concerns. And through the whole route of Chippy to New York City, 4 different species of sturgeon will be impacted, 2 in Canada and 2 in the Hudson River. So we say any project that negatively impacts the Hudson River's ecosystem does not deserve Tier 4 subsidies. There are better cable options that have been proposed, and they don't use hydropower to generate electricity. They supply New York State sourced solar and wind power, which is not only renewable, but sustainable and doesn't damage ecosystems. It's routed down the thruway instead of the Hudson River. It crosses the Tappan Zee Bridge, crosses the river at the Tappan Zee Bridge. It's a latitudinal crossing of the river instead of longitudinal use of the river. And Tier 4 is likely to support 2 of the 7 options. We want to support the most beneficial and ecologically least benign projects. So to make that decision, we need to take a precautionary approach. supplying New York City with electricity. And we need the governor to choose wisely. I will say, the last thing I'll say is the folks at TDI and Blackstone, imagine that minimal harm from Chippy, imagine minimal harm to the, from Chippy to the Hudson's ecosystems. But there's an old saying, it says, do not tell fish stories where the people know you, but even worse, don't tell them where they know the fish. At Riverkeeper, we know the river and we know the fish. Don't tell us fish stories.
Thank you, George. That was absolutely wonderful. Would it be possible to know the names of those two, for example, of those two that you're recommending, or can you bring that in at the end of the program?
I don't have all we don't have all the details right now, but
Okay.
This is an ongoing process.
Okay.
And what we want is the governor to choose the most benign project. We don't want cables running the length of the Hudson River.
Right.
And I'll put a link to our action in the chat.
Okay. Okay, because the Excelsior Connect, it sounded very much like one of those you were describing. Shay is going to
Actually,
be.
it might be, but I didn't want to get into the names. I didn't want to confuse them.
Shay is going. Our last speaker is going to be talking about specifics of the Tier 4. George, thank you so much. I am so amazed at all that detail of the fish.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yes, you're welcome, George. Our next speaker is also about the Hudson River, and this is about the people along the Hudson River. 2 counties, 7 communities who get their drinking water from the Hudson River. And I'm going to be introducing, or I am introducing to you, Mayor Gary Bassett, who is chairman of the Hudson 7, a group that organized themselves around the need for their drinking water and the need to protect it. And Gary is also the mayor of the village of Rhinebeck. Gary Bassett, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you, Catherine, and thank you for inviting me to this forum. You're going to be hearing a lot of repeat in terms of what we're going to do, but I want to introduce it, by talking a little bit about the Hudson 7. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this all works for you.
Okay.
All right.
Do I do okay, you got it. Okay.
Can everybody see this fine?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So as Catherine mentioned, now I'm chair, not only the mayor for the village of Rhinebeck, which is right on the Hudson River, just a little short way south of Albany. And in our vicinity, we have many municipalities, there's 7, that we get our drinking water directly from the Hudson River. And most of the other communities use wells, we do not. So when we formed this organization prior, it was really about how can we protect our drinking water and going forward, because the Hudson River is our source of drinking water. So what we did was collaborate with these 7 municipalities, which are the town of Esopus, town of Hyde Park, town of Lloyd, town and city of Poughkeepsie, and town and village of Rhinebeck, who represent 100,000 people that get their drinking water from the Hudson River. Again, our mission was to protect the Hudson River, because the Hudson River is a source of not only fish, as you heard, but also a source of our drinking water. So the council was formed, and in government time, it was like lightning speed that these 7 municipalities could get together and collaborate and come up with an intermunicipal agreement that said we are all going to be united as elected officials to work toward protecting the Hudson River and protect this for, which is over 100,000 people in the vicinity. So you remember, there's east side and west side. There's 3 of the water plants on the east side and 2 on the west side. But so we have 5 water plants that represent these 100,000 people that are drawing from it. And we are all made up of elected officials. So to get 7 municipalities together, or 7 even elected officials together, and within a course of a matter of less than 8 months, we were able to sign that intermunicipal agreement between us all, is just a record pace. And it just shows the dedication of the people and the elected officials here to preserve and protect the Hudson River. So we really have, in the last 3 years since we joined, really accomplished quite a bit. I just want to share a little bit of the things that we've been working on, to give you a taste of how we're reacting and how we're getting attention, not only locally, but at the state level for the work that we're doing. And we've done work that directly address the combined sewer overflows. And there's over hundreds of them along the river that are coming into it. So we're working with those communities and working with the state to get funding to help them protect that. And there is motion along that line to make that happen. When we first got together, one of the things that really united us all was they were looking to parking barges on the Hudson River and use it as a staging for crude oil. And there would be many barge sites located, and some of these barge sites were located directly at our water intakes. So we said, you can't allow this because there's been nothing to stop or prevent a spill that would directly impact one of our intakes that would impact, giving water. The city of Poughkeepsie has 3 major hospitals and colleges, and so they rely on getting, they do 10 million gallons a day in terms of water that they process. And they have a small reservoir, but not enough if their impact gets, if we have to start shutting down hospitals or colleges because the water's been contaminated. So that was really one of the major issues that brought us all together, was how can we fight that? And we worked very hard with the Coast Guard, and we continue to work with the Coast Guard on prevention strategies for the Upper Hudson. In the 100 years ago, in item 3 here, basically the former manufactured gas plants of Poughkeepsie, under the utilities guidance, dumped coal tar right directly in the Hudson River. To this day, we're still working with them to clean up that coal tar because it is a contaminant in the Hudson River. We're fighting disinfection byproducts. We're seeing the emergence of pharmaceuticals and unregulated contaminants everly increasing in the Hudson River. And most recently, as you've been all made aware, the submerged route of the Champlain-Hudson Power Express. And we are trying to say to them, at first, our goal was to say, listen, we understand and that power is needed, but there's other ways to get power. But by burying that cable in the Hudson River and going directly near or almost through our intakes can and will impact the intake water that we're processing for our residents. And then, I don't know if you all recently heard, there was a last December storm that brought huge amounts of sediment into the Ashokan Reservoir, which feeds the drinking water to New York City. Well, New York City, for the first time through DEC, said, we're just going to flush that into the Hudson River and let the Hudson River take care of it. Well, that produced a lot of issues for us because our plants are set up for turbidity, but we're not set up to take the continued supply of turbidity that was released by the DEC to supply drinking water to New York City. So we continue to fight these, we continue to work, and we've gotten state level attention at almost all of these issues that we're working for. But that brings us to our concern tonight. Our concern tonight is, what are we doing about chipping, right? And the chipping process, as I mentioned, our foremost reason was we need to protect the Hudson River, and we need to also protect our drinking water. And we are concerned that putting that cable into the river poses a physical risk to our intakes and hiding the risk of contamination. The jet plowing technology, which you heard previously, it has not been proven to work in a tidal basin like the Hudson River. We are asking for TDI to come forward and demonstrate and to tuck the pilot in the river near where we can do it to make sure that that process of jet plowing, which is really a 3-foot wide by 7-foot deep trench, will not release all of those contaminants that you just heard in a previous presentation. And then the protocols to respond to monitor. How are they going to manage this when they do it? They said, we'll monitor it at the outtake, but they're not monitoring it at the intake. And that's where we need to do the monitoring. At the intake to our water treatment plants, not at the outtake. And as I mentioned, we have limited water supply. Village of Rhinebeck, I have a 2 million gallon tank and I use 500,000 gallons a day. So basically I can have a 3-day supply. But if I have to shut down a water treatment plant, I do not have a backup. There is no backup for many of us along the Hudson River because we had the Hudson River, not wells, and backup systems were not designed to be put into those places where we had that risk of contamination. But more and more, as you're hearing, not only 1, but 2, but 3, but multiple agencies are now planning to bury cables. And when will this end? And how will we protect our drinking water with every one of these? So, and last, the issue that you're all here for is we're using Canadian hydropower, which, as you heard, is inherently damaged to our rivers. It has a major impact on the Indigenous people, which are from William, and it is far more carbon intensive than wind or solar. We need to be focused on how we can use the renewable energies here in New York and not building more dams or using hydropower. We need renewable sources. We need the government to get behind us. So what have we asked for? We've asked for Chippy to, upon our request, to show us what the environmental management and construction plan is. It's known as the EM&CP. And that process and the jet plowing technique with the protective measures. You can see in the picture over here, the picture of a jet plow submerged in a basin. Now you're seeing a nice flat surface. The river well, you don't know, the river is not basically a flat surface. It has a lot of outcroppings and rock and other issues that need to be dealt with. So this is not a simple process. It's not going to be as quick as what they say. They say they can go through and be past our water intake plants. Now remember, 5 of them that they have to weave through the river on and be gone in 20 minutes. We've asked them to prove that because 20 minutes with a tidal basin, we get the Hudson River, the tide flows both ways, as you all know. So we are expecting contamination for up to 2 miles in either direction, just as a result of this plowing mechanism. So we've asked, and we're working with them, and we're trying to get a demonstration of their jet plowing operations that are near our water utility intakes. So we can understand exactly what we have to deal with when this happens, and we can protect the drinking water. So what can you do for us? I think you've heard it on a previous presentation. You can call on Governor Hochul and your New York State elected authorities to make that right decision. It's the same thing that you heard before. Ask them to make a decision on renewable subsidies that could have lesser consequences on the Hudson Rivers and the communities that are along the river and our Indigenous communities in Canada. He just talked about Tier 4 credits. Again, we need you to make the call to Governor Hochul, make the call to New York State, and tell them, that you are not in favor of burying underwater cables, tearing up the river bottom to bring energy to New York City, right? And join us in urging New York State to award Tier 4 energy credits to projects that support New York State businesses. That's what we're asking from you. That's what the work that we're doing. I hope that, our organization with Hudson 7 has only been involved for 3 years. We continue to work very closely with Riverkeeper in all the work that we do as part of our technical advisors. But we need foremost to protect the Hudson River as a source of our drinking water. And activities like this are a threat to over 100,000 people in just our area who get their drinking water. So thank you. I think I just hit the wrong button here to my presentation, but I'll bring it back. And if you have any questions, please just reach out to me. You can find me as the mayor of Village of Rhinebeck. And we have a website for Hudson 7 And Hudson 7 is because we are 7 municipalities that work. So please email me or reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns.
Gary?
Thank you, Gary.
Gary?
Yes.
Gary, what one of the things we did during when we were fighting Hydropower when they wanted to do the Great Whale Project was I went in and I found that they said on their electrical bills, do not bend, staple, or fold.
Yeah.
We told people, because, you know, I studied data processing a long time ago. I said, this is like a modern day punch card. It's not illegal to bend, staple, or fold these things. With your payment, staple it shut and put on it, no Hydro-Quebec. I said, and as a result, they're going to have to hire people to open these things. So they're going to have to buy more equipment, open offices, etc. So it's going to cost them. The first month was about 500. Second month was a little bit more. And by the third month, it was up to 15,000 people. And we were showing it as, oh, not only can you do something against the bills that you hate, because everyone hates paying, you know, an electricity bill, but you can help the indigenous people or the native people elsewhere. And basically after 3 months, they asked us to stop the campaign. And let me put it this way, it ended up being around 15,000 or so people. Do you think most of them knew about us? No, they hated the electrical companies. This is something maybe you could do. I don't know if it'll work now, but it might help you out.
Right. Good idea. Thank you.
If you can get the electrical companies to start going, oh my God, no, this is going to cost us a shitload of money.
Well, I think, and again, we're trying to reach out to the New York City elected officials as well.
Yeah.
And make them aware. And,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that's where they get.
like
Yeah.
this two-pronged attack.
Well, thank you, Will. Thank you, Will, for that suggestion. And thank you, Gary, for your wonderful presentation. And I'm glad we're all here because we're working together on this. And if there's anything specifically Sierra Club can do where we can support you, I think we're all sort of in this together working against the chippy. But thank you very much. And we want to help you succeed in protecting your drinking water and in protecting the river. Now, the last two speakers, have to do with the topic of solutions, and there have been references made to these. Bob Chichalski will be the first of these, and he is the chair of the Sierra Club New York Atlantic Chapter Energy Committee, and he's been dealing with Tier 1 and Tier 2. And we newly have an office in New York State called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, ORES. And it has to do with eliminating some NIMBYism and moving along the, not only the siting, but then the actual production installation and getting these solar and wind and all these various renewable energy projects up and running. So Bob, the chair is yours and the floor is yours. And let's try to keep it to 7 minutes. I'm very sorry we're short on time here. And then we'll have Shay speak on the Tier 4, which is the group of NYSERDA projects that can actually perhaps be a successful alternative or alternatives to chippy. Bob, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I put together a short slide presentation here. Up till about 2016, when the state adopted the Clean Energy Standard, we had certain goals in the state for solar, wind, and small hydro, but they were all voluntary. So in around 2016, the Clean Energy Standard was created. And as a result of that, there was a renewable energy standard mechanism. And that basically requires utilities and other load serving entities, those are distribution utilities of electric power, to purchase renewable energy credits. And they can be purchased from the state, they can be purchased from third-party entities such as solar, wind farms, small hydro projects, or they can be produced themselves by the utilities. So as of Tier 1 basically deals with new renewables that are being created, and this requires a certain amount of purchase of new renewable energy by utilities. Tier 2 are maintenance resources. Those were utilities, solar, wind, and small hydro that were in place before 2015. And one of the issues is here, while we can use solar and wind and small hydro to reach our goal of 70% renewables by 2030 without chippy, as you see here, the obligations are actually pared down a little bit. It's on the right in 2021 from what was originally set that the utility should be purchasing 4.20% of their electricity from renewable sources to 2.04. And we believe that was basically, it was adopted last October, probably as a result of the COVID. 2022, you can again see a reduction. We were supposed to be at 8.4%. And next year, that's only a few months away. That's now been reduced to 5.6%. By 2023, we're supposed to have 8.2% of our renewables from RECs purchased by utilities. Okay, now we have the electric sector where we are now. This is 2018. We have about 3 to 4% of our electricity currently being produced by wind power. Other is where solar falls in. We have about 1.5 to 2% of the state's electricity being produced by solar. So we're at about 5% from those renewable sources. Hydro, which is basically Messina and Niagara Falls, is 23%. So altogether, we're now at maybe 28, 29% of our electricity from renewables. But you see what we have to overcome, the nuclear and the gas. Now, it is possible to reach that 70% goal by 2030. We will need 45 million megawatt hours of electricity. This is just one study that was conducted, and actually David Alicia gave me these figures. 25% would come from utility solar. That is not the rooftop solar, but this is large scale solar. 25% from onshore wind plants and 50% from offshore wind. This would translate roughly to 6,000 megawatts from solar, 3,500 megawatts from onshore wind, and 5,000 from offshore wind. Now, the target for offshore wind has actually been increased to 2035 to 9,000 megawatts. I believe right now we've got contracts for about 4,500. The solar, beside the utility scale solar, there's also the rooftop that's been going on through New York Sun, and we're about 2,000 megawatts there. So you can see we can easily pass the 1,200 megawatts of electricity that would go into New York City from chippy by these sources if they were properly developed. And what does this look like? The 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind would involve 700 to 750 12 megawatt turbines. These are the larger turbines that are used in the ocean. There'd also be about 6,000 megawatts of solar. It would take up about 0.1% of New York's land. That would include brownfields, land along highways, rooftop. If we only built on farmland, you'd be looking at about 0.6% of our farmland. But the good thing about solar is oftentimes and wind is that the leases pay farmers to lease their land to utility producers, to renewable companies. So oftentimes farmers are able to keep their land in production because they're getting extra money from solar and wind projects. And then you also have about 3,500 megawatts of onshore wind, and that's about 700 smaller 5 megawatt turbines. I don't know where I am for time here, but
Wrap it up as soon as you can, Bob. I'm sorry
Hey,
to have to say that,
as
but
everybody said, you know, we can come up with false solutions. If we don't develop this quickly enough, there's going to be a big push for gas and things like chippy. One of the best tools for developing large-scale renewable energy is our Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which was created last year by legislation and went into effect this April. This somewhat speeds along the granting of permits, although basically, while permits can be granted within 1 year of an application being made for a large-scale solar or wind project, most of the work done by developers has to be done ahead of time. You know, often that involves several years of environmental studies and meeting with community members and those items. Right now, these are the projects that are in the queue and how many megawatts they total. They haven't been approved, but you can see we already have about 8,500 megawatts if these projects were approved. And there's one last slide I have. This just sometimes people ask how many homes can be powered by a megawatt, and they actually differ by the source. So utility scale solar can power about 215, 1 megawatt can power 215 to 280. Land-based wind, because wind is more efficient in producing electricity, that's 245 to 400, and offshore wind, because of the steady winds, can power 225 to 680. So that's my talk. I just believe that, as Catherine said, we can meet our goals with renewables. We don't have to, and Canadian Hydro, actually, when the Clean Energy Standard was first brought about, everybody thought that there would be no energy credits given to out-of-state renewables. And obviously, Canadian Hydro would be one of those. So that's my presentation. So thank you very much.
thank you, Bob, very much. Sorry to have to rush you, but I'm glad we're going to be having a recording on this, and thank you and congratulations on the great work with the ORES and moving these renewable energy projects along. Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
And everyone, if you could stay a few minutes, we may be going over. It's okay with me, but you're all invited to stay on as long as we need. And Shay is up, and Shay O'Reilly is the New York City and Hudson Valley organizing representative, and he's in charge of the campaign to stop 2 new potential, we hope they won't become realized, new frack gas power plants, Dance Camera and Astoria. And Shay, as you have already heard, will be talking about the renewable energy projects from Tier 4. Thank you, Shay.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction. And I'm very flattered to be in the company of so many great speakers who are so knowledgeable on so many issues. So I'm going to make it pretty quick here. First of all, I want to be a little clear. What are we talking about when we say tiers? So the state clean energy standard is essentially the mechanism the state is using to meet our clean energy goals in New York State. The way it works is essentially the state says we need this much of this kind of power. You heard about Tier 1 and Tier 2 from Bob. And so we're going to essentially let developers apply, and if they're awarded these projects or these credits under the clean energy standard, the cost of building them is shared across the state. So every utility is mandated either to buy power from them or to purchase credits that can be used to support their development. So you can think about it as really understanding that clean energy downstate benefits upstate communities because it reduces the amount of climate pollution that we're pumping into their air, and vice versa. So Tier 4 was developed with the idea that we need another thing to incentivize transmission lines to New York City to carry quote unquote clean energy. I want to be clear that I have a lot of fights with their definition of clean energy because we don't think that Canadian hydro and big mega dams are clean. It was initially seen by renewable developers and experts as tailored to incentivize the Champlain-Hudson Power Express line. Basically, we know that former Governor Andrew Cuomo was very close with Blackstone, which is the company, the parent company of TDI, the company that wants to build the line. And he actually came out last spring saying that we needed to build the Chippy to recover from the COVID pandemic. And after that, they announced the Tier 4.
Sorry.
So it would otherwise be really, really expensive to build this line if the cost was borne purely by New York City. We know that the city has been interested in buying power for some time, but that's kind of the structure here. However, it has changed over time since that initial proposal. I'll talk about why and how. So first of all, why do we need new transmission? I get people asking me this all the time. They're like, can't we just build, put solar on rooftops here in New York City, put offshore wind out to sea? The answer is yes, we can do both those things. But what we're really talking about here is that the grid looks really, really different across New York State. So these are two charts from the New York Independent Systems Operator, which is the entity that regulates our grid. It shows the energy composition of upstate and downstate energy. Now, this is from 2018. So in the intervening time, Indian Point has shut down, yay. And what that meant is that the share of nuclear power in downstate energy has shrunk, has vanished essentially. And so that's been made up significantly both by energy efficiency, which somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, and then also by a little bit more oil and gas coming online or operating at a fuller capacity factor. So that's not so great. We want to make sure we're making that up with clean energy. But this is often called the tale of two grids. Basically that upstate energy is relatively low emissions and downstate energy is relatively high emissions. There are no credible analyses of decarbonizing downstate's electric sector that have found that it can be done without increased upstate downstate transmission. Essentially, this is a case where everybody agrees we need new transmission to bring clean energy from upstate to downstate. And again, this benefits everyone because that means we can take off the dirtiest power plants in New York State that are contributing disproportionately to climate chaos. It's worth noting that there are reliability requirements attached to New York City's power sector that mandate that 80% of New York City's energy is generated either in the city or brought in via what's called a dedicated transmission line. So what that means is this isn't just a line that plugs into the rest of the grid upstate. This is a line that has resources, generational resources attached to it that dispatch first to that line and then to other parts of the grid. We know that, for example, this solar farm will always be sending 200 megawatts down this line. It's not the case that that 200 megawatts, 500 megawatts will go into the grid, and then we'll send some 200 megawatts from Albany down to New York City. Offshore wind will provide a significant chunk of the city's energy needs in the future. We have a number of amazing projects that have been permitted. But with electrification, which is converting all of our really, really dirty buildings to electric heating and cooling, we are going to need more power than offshore wind can provide under current expectations. One thing to note is that offshore wind can also be potentially brought upstate, up the Hudson Valley, especially if the transmission lines are built right, so you can have bidirectional flow of electricity. However, while we may need new transmission, we do not need the Chippy line. So in 2020, when the Tier 4 proposal was announced, we fought really hard alongside partners in the environmental justice, environmental and clean energy spaces to try and stop Tier 4 from including Chippy. We did all kinds of things. We said, you can't call Canadian hydro clean. You have to account for the fact that if Hydro-Quebec is exporting power down to New York, that means it's not exporting power to New Brunswick, and maybe New Brunswick is making its coal plants run a bit more, so we can't call that clean energy. We want to prioritize in-state resources, all that stuff. We did actually lose that fight, so the state still included hydropower as an eligible resource, but we did win on changing the language of the actual solicitation so that it is a more competitive and inclusive process. So remember how I said that initially this was seen as just a giveaway to Chippy and Hydro-Quebec? That's not the case. In fact, we have 7 different proposals now within Tier 4 with several variations on each proposal. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the alternatives. I want to be really clear that the Sierra Club has not endorsed a specific alternative. Right now, we're saying not the chippy line, but some of this is just that, you know, the state is going to be considering a number of factors, some of which we're not as knowledgeable on, but we are knowledgeable enough to say no to chippy. So one of them is Evangrid Excelsior Connect. It brings in-state renewables to New York City and can accommodate bidirectional flow to bring power upstate too. They're predicting 17,400 jobs for New Yorkers, and it plugs in next to the Ravenswood station in Queens, the Rainy substation. Light and Power's Catskills Renewable Connector also brings in-state renewables to New York City. It plugs in at the Ravenswood generating station, which is owned by Rise Light and Power, and they're building new battery storage right now so they can shut down their dirty peaking power plants. I will say that Rise Light and Power does use a chunk of the Hudson River as a right of way, although I believe less than Chippy. So we have concerns about that, and I'll mention those in a second. And then finally, of the kind of these 3 I'm just mentioning here is the New York Power Authority's Clean Path New York, which plugs in the South Bronx and combines in-state renewable energy with underutilized pumped hydro storage that already exists in New York State. It's the Blenheim Gilboa facility, and they're expecting around 10,000 jobs for that plan as well. When we got all the bids in earlier this summer, 14 powerful environmental organizations across the state, including Riverkeeper, Environmental Advocates, New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, we signed on to a letter to then Governor Cuomo. We should actually probably re-forward it to Governor Hochul, making sure it didn't get lost in somebody's inbox, requesting that the state select projects that do not use the Hudson as an extended right of way, that do not harm Indigenous nations, and that connect at places that allow us to retire dirty fossil fuel plants. Those are kind of our 3 main areas. We call these responsible contracting standards, and we've actually had luck with letters like that in the past on things like offshore wind contracting standards, stuff like that. So New York may choose 1, 2, or even 3 of these options. I think we're expecting them to choose 2, but it's our job to tell them not to pick the Champlain Hudson Power Express, right? So we have the power. Governor Hochul and the New York State Independent Energy Research and Development Authority, NYSERDA, they work for the people of New York. It's our responsibility to stand up and tell them that we don't want chippy, we don't want Canadian mega dams.
Thank you, Shay, for your explaining to us the several options of renewable energy from New York State that we have as possibilities. So we have alternate renewable energy, New York State renewable energy to supply New York City with our electricity. So we do not need Chippy, the Champlain Hudson Power Express. If you did not get your questions answered, which we did not get to, you may send them either to the speakers or to myself. And I want to again thank Sierra Club New York City Group and Grow New York, Grow Renewable New York, No Canadian Hydro for working together to present this. And I want to thank you again for joining us this evening. Please get in touch with Governor Hochul and remind her that there are wonderful opportunities for alternatives for getting electricity to New York City that are not as destructive to the Indigenous in Canada or to the Hudson River or to the 7 communities, the people of the 7 communities living along the Hudson River. Okay, so here are a few, I'm going to show you a few websites that you might want to look into. Here are the websites for our local Sierra Club that is presenting this, and the state, which is the Atlantic chapter, and National Sierra Club, Riverkeeper, and our governor, Kathy Hochul. So you can get in touch with her via computer. And also here's the email for the website for the New York State Department of Conservation. Okay. Thank you so much again for joining us this evening, and take care and be well. And remember, no chippy, no way. Good night.